Morning, everyone. My name is Lynn Dahman. I'm the Managing Director for Purdue's Institute for a Sustainable Future, and I'm very happy to be collaborating today with our good friends at the White River Alliance. And I think you will all enjoy the discussion today about Indiana water, as well as the interaction between groundwater and surface water. I am going to hand it over to Jill Hoffman, Director of the White River Alliance, and then Bill Bloomquist, also from White River Alliance, will introduce our speakers one by one. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. It's, yeah, I was going to say, it's telling me that I can't share when you're sharing. It's works good that way, so we don't talk over each other. While I'm pulling up this very short slide deck today, I just wanted to, my goodness, let me see if I'm situated here. Can you guys all see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. Preview there on the slides. Just a welcome from us on behalf of the White River Alliance. We're super excited to be here. Water is in the media, seems every day, recently with some important conversation and understanding the connections between our groundwater and surface water. Those connections and conversations really important to managing both our supply and our ecological health of the systems. Happy to be here. I just wanted to provide a very brief context for this forum. If this is first one of its kind for you, or if you're aware, we do try to host topics throughout the year and try to engage our academic community so that they are helping take the research that they're doing out of the universities and into kind of the practical world where many of us sit as water professionals. As a matter of reminder, we've been on quite a journey doing lots of different types of forums. We tend to try to cover topics that take a little bit longer than we could do in the Indiana Water Summit, which is where a lot of this work around policy and science and the intersection really sit. So we've hosted these sorts of policy and science discussions on wetlands, on PFAS, floodplains, water withdrawals, climate change. So if this is your first one, welcome. If you're back for more fun, welcome back. And just know that we will continue to try to do our best to bring you this sort of information on a semi-regular basis between water summits. Speaking of the Water Summit, just a quick brief announcement. Mark your brand new calendars. Our 7th annual Water Summit will be this year, August 21st and 22nd. We are shifting locations due to growth, which is awesome. We sold out the summit last year. We are moving over to the Builtwell Event Center, and we'll engage in some really interactive sessions this next year. So get that one on your calendar. And with that, I'm going to just throw it over to my colleague, Bill Bloomquist, who's going to tell us who's speaking today for us. And again, thank you so much for being engaged in the protection and understanding of our water resources. We can't do it without a wide community involved in these conversations. So thank you. Bill?
Thanks, Jill, and good morning, everyone. Happy to be with you and happy to introduce these presenters, some of whom are repeat presenters for us, folks who've done these things with us before, and we appreciate it. We especially appreciate the partnership with Purdue Institute of Sustainable Future and Water Resources Research Center. Director of the Water Resources Research Center is going to go first. That's Dr. Keith Cherkauer, who is Professor of Agriculture and Biological Engineering at Purdue University. And through his research, Professor Cherkauer works to integrate different methods, field-based observations, remote sensing, and hydrology models to address questions and concerns related to environmental change. We are then going to turn to Dave Lampe, who is a hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey in their Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana Water Science Center.
I'm on a webinar.
Currently the acting associate director for Indiana in that center. Dave has worked at USGS for 20 years.
Make sure they put it in the closeout.
And is the Okay, and our third speaker is Dr. Marty Frisbee, who is an associate professor in the Department of Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences at Purdue University. And his research focuses on groundwater surface water interactions with an emphasis on how groundwater responds to effects of both climate change and land use change. So we're delighted to have these three presenters. There, you see the little asterisk there on the slide. I just wanted to also mention that Keith Cherkauer and Marty Frisbee are two of the five co-authors of a new report, Managing Water in a Wet State, which you can find on the Purdue Institute for Sustainability website. It's a really nicely done, I think about a 5-pager. So it's a great condensation of a lot of information. So Keith, having buttered you up hopefully adequately, I am going to hand it to you, and Keith is going to share his presentation with us on water conditions in Indiana over the past year. We can see that. That's great.
All right. Can you see the presentation now?
Yes.
It's on the wrong screen, so I'm not going to be looking at the camera.
Okay.
But I got it working. I'm going to leave it there. We'll get my laser pointer out. So yeah, I'm going to give an overview of kind of the current state of Indiana water resources, and also get a little bit into what we expect in the future. And thanks for mentioning two of my three institute affiliations, but Lynn's on the phone, so if I don't mention that I'm the co-lead of the Water Challenges Research Community as part of the Institute for Sustainable Future, I will get in trouble. So starting with a look back at water year 2023, so that is the water year that ended September 30th, 2023. The Indiana Water Resources Research Center's got a site where we do kind of a retrospective of each water year as it finishes out. And in this case, we look at changes and state of water resources over the previous 30 years. So at the end of water year 2023, it looks at both groundwater and stream flow measurements. Groundwater is based on kind of a depth of water table below the ground surface. So as that depth to the water table increases, that is equal to having less water in the aquifer. Stream flow is based on change in stream flow height or discharge stage based on USGS gauging stations. And so as the stream flow elevation increases, then that's saying we have an increase in water resources in the state. In this map, they are ranked over the last 30 years. So the 50th percentile, which is shown here with that kind of bluish color, would be equivalent to the 30-year average. So that would be rank 15 out of 30 different 30 different years. If we look at the water state at the end of September in this year, you can see that most of the groundwater reporting stations are brown. 22 out of the 31 long-term groundwater monitoring stations were at or below the 25th percentile, so indicating that they are quite dry relative to historical values. On the stream flow side of things, 96 out of 108 stations were at or below the 25th percentile. So the state ended very dry. If we look kind of specifically at a couple of locations, so here is the Wabash River at Lafayette, Indiana. So this is the Brown Street gauge. You can see the red line is indicating what stream flow looked like in the Wabash River this year. The blue line is the 30-year average, and the gray lines are the last 10 years of individual stream flow. And you can see that the Wabash River was below average, well below average for most of the year, including finishing out the water year well below average. There were a couple of points in early spring where we got wet. On the groundwater side, if we look at Tippecanoe 8 monitoring well, so this one is in Tippecanoe County, kind of the northwest corner of the county. Again, the gray lines are the last 10 years of observations. The blue line is the mean for the last 30 years, and the red line is showing you what water table heights were this year. And again, this is depth of water below the water surface, so a larger negative number indicates that the water table has declined. And so again, we are seeing water table elevations in this one monitoring well below kind of the long-term average. If we look at the drought indicators at the end of the season, so at the end of September, so September 26, 2023 was the last U.S. drought monitor map for the state. You can see that most of the state, actually 85.3% of the state is in what's called moderate drought condition, with the yellow being areas that are moderately dry or abnormally dry. So only up and around the Great Lakes were we outside of drought condition at the end of the year. If we look back at the last water year, this was an especially dry year, not record-breaking. This was not a 2012 drought year, but it was a year where we had a fair amount of dry conditions. So we were in drought. About 50% of the state was in drought even as early as July. As we got into June, sorry, this is the last 2 years. So wrapping up last year, we were in drought. We recovered in the spring a bit, but then we spent a fair amount of the summer and then the end of the year with increasing drought conditions. So you need to put that in perspective because we're talking about kind of how things are changing or how things might change. So the end of 2023, we were very dry. And not quite setting records for dryness, but definitely very dry. If we look at, however, trends over the last 30 years, we can see that most of the state, both groundwater and surface water, have generally been increasing. So conditions are getting wetter for most of the state. The groundwater is clearly much more of a mixed bag, with several more locations indicating a decrease in groundwater levels in storage, but surface water streams are definitely going up. Where the triangles are filled, that's an indication of a statistically significant change. So I guess the most concerning ones would be those 3 groundwater monitoring wells in the kind of the northwest part of the state, which are showing some statistical decline. But in general, we are getting wetter. That goes along with average annual precipitation, which has been increasing since 1895 to 2015. We've had an increase of about ½ an inch per decade. That has resulted in increases in precipitation on the order of 4 to over 8 inches over the last 100 years, depending on which part of the state you're in. More of that increase being to the south, but even to the north, we are seeing more precipitation. That is expected to continue into the future. So by middle of this current century, by the 2050s, we are projecting to see an 8% increase in annual rainfall. But this is where we get into managing with more variability. That increase in rainfall has not been and is not projected to be uniform across the year. Historically, we have seen increases in precipitation in the winter and spring, and we are projecting that those increases in the winter and spring will continue. So by mid-century, 20% increase in winter precipitation, 16% in spring precipitation, whereas summer and fall, it's more of a mixed bag with the future climate scenarios, but generally trending towards a slight decrease in precipitation during those times of the year. Couple that with increased air temperature, you get more evapotranspiration, so more water evaporating from lakes and wetlands, but also more water being used by plants. So increases of 6 to 7% by middle of the century and 5 to 10% by the late part of the century. That means that things are getting, not only we are seeing less precipitation in the summer, but we're also, plants are using more of that water in the summer. Additionally, warmer conditions means that we have less days with snow on the ground. So for central Indiana, seeing potentially changes in number of days from 60 to 36, so almost a half of the number of days with snowfall. And that snowfall sticks around far less, so it doesn't function as well as a storage for us through the winter. And then again, looking at changes in precipitation, so that 8% increase in annual average precipitation starts to increase runoff from the land surface by about 10% on an annual basis. But if we look at seasonally, we're seeing or projecting increases of 14 and 24% in the winter and spring, with decreases in the summer of 14 and 16% by the 2050s. And if we switch to the late part of the century, winter and spring continue to get wetter, summer and fall continue to get drier. Again, it's not driven, the summer and fall getting drier is not driven completely by precipitation decrease. There's a little bit of precipitation decrease, but it is driven a lot by the increase in temperature and how that affects evapotranspiration. As far as subsurface drain flow, so that's a big issue, especially in the northern part of the state where almost every ag field up here is drained. Seeing or projecting increases there of drain flow of 27 to 50% by mid or late century. That's because those wetter conditions in the winter and spring are being drained out with there's less snow, there's less soil frost. So more water is moving through the system in the winter and in the spring. And so the subsurface drain flow will increase, which should have an effect on kind of increasing base flow in our rivers in the winter. Highest 10% of high flows, there we're looking at 12% increase by the 2050s and 15% increase by the 2080s. So that 10% of high flows, those aren't necessarily the record floods, but those are the very large floods. And we've had several of those in the last couple of decades, and the expectation is that those will get bigger potentially and more frequent. And then, this is my last data slide. So all of this means that we're basically getting a shift in our hydrologic cycle. So that increase in precipitation in the winter and spring is going to result in higher stream flow amounts in those seasons. And this is looking at the White River near Indianapolis. I've got analysis for other rivers in the state, but the patterns are fairly similar. So you can see higher flows December through May. That's a challenge for infrastructure. It's right, bridges, culverts, other things need to be sized correctly for that. But then as we get into June, July, August, we start to see that stream flow is below average. And in particular, that increases out into September, where we're seeing potentially more than 15% decrease in stream flow. And so we have this increasing problem where we have a wealth of water that in a lot of cases, farmers are going to put drainage in and try to move that off the landscape and out of their fields in the winter and spring. And then we're all going to wish we had it back when we get to the summer and the fall. And so considering how we can better manage that, and I think that kind of leads us into the rest of the presentations, because some of that is that surface water, groundwater interaction. And so I will wrap up there. I think I'm just over my 10 minutes with just a thank you. I've got a couple of links here, and Bill, I think, and Jill have said that they're sharing the other links to most of the same documents. Thank you.
Keith, we're really grateful for that. We're gonna, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, we're gonna do two Q&A portions here. Keith's report is, although he transitioned it nicely to the groundwater surface water interaction topic that will take up the rest of our time, but Keith's report was sufficiently distinct from what we're going to hear from Dave and Marty that we're going to do a short, like 5-minute Q&A session now, and then we'll have Dave and we'll have Marty give their presentations, which are more directly focused on that groundwater surface water interaction topic. And then we'll have another Q&A session after that. So I just wanted to say that you can post a question for Keith in the chat using the chat function. And Keith, I'm just going to go first while people are thinking of their questions. And your report on 2023 and then putting it in the context of the last 30 years, obviously super interesting and informative. I also wanted to see what you can tell us about water use, because it seems like there's a couple of variables. One is seasonal patterns, which you described, long-term trends, which you described. But then when we also think about like places in the state that have significant variation, high or low, with respect to things like groundwater levels or surface water flows, an additional variable could be use, right? So what do we know and what do we not know about water use, which would be another part of that equation, right?
Yeah, and I'll say I deleted that slide. I thought I didn't have time for that particular question.
Oh, damn. Sorry.
It's okay. Right. There are definitely projections of increasing water use in the state. Historically, over the last several decades, the USGS releases their 5-year water use summaries.
Yeah.
The last one was 2015. I don't know that Dave has seen the 2020 yet. It usually is a few years delayed. So hopefully it will come out soon. I would say historically, we were seeing kind of increases in water use in the state until 2005, 2010, and then we started to see some decreases. That most of that decrease in water use is because thermoelectric generation, which is using a lot of the water, has become more efficient. It is not using as much water as it has in the past. As far as overall water use, irrigation water use has been growing in the state. There was a change in that increase in that rate of adoption of irrigation after the 2012 drought. So a whole lot more people putting in irrigation. Most of that irrigation has been using groundwater. So if you look at the trends for the last 30, 40 years in where water is getting pulled from, surface water use for irrigation is essentially flat, while groundwater use has tripled. And that is there is information on that in the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment Water Report, which I think, I don't know, NCCIA water. So that has been posted in the chat. So there's some more detail on that, and also some look at the kind of the future projections of water use. The last one that we did at Purdue is showing kind of increased water use in the counties in the Northwest, so up around Gary, but also in counties around Marion County. Marion County actually showing a bit of a decrease as manufacturing. I believe what's happening is the manufacturing is moving out, and thermoelectric generation is moving out of Marion and into the surrounding counties. So their water use is going up. Marion's is going down a little bit because of that.
There's two questions. There are two questions in the chat, Keith, that I'm going to pose to you. There's a third question that I'm going to hold for our other speakers. But the two for you, one, I don't know if you can see the chat stream, but one is just what method was used for PE calculation. So if you want to take that one first, and then I've got one other.
I'm going to assume the PE means potential evapotranspiration.
I assume so. Yes.
I assume. So we used a large scale hydrology model, which uses the climate inputs, soils, and other information, and it is using Penman-Monteith with daily climate data to produce estimates of evapotranspiration, depending on which. So that would be the quick answer to that.
Yeah. Okay. And then the other question for you was about wetlands protection. The question is, how does recent legislation decreasing wetlands protection factor into this? Rather than march you out on that plank, I'll simply ask you, when you were talking about, when we have abundant water in the winter and spring and then wish we had it in the summer and fall, obviously one solution to that is storing water. What role do wetlands play in that sort of thing?
Wetlands can play a big role, should play a big role in that. Right. I think Indiana doesn't have a whole lot of space for new reservoirs. I think we're much more likely to be looking for low spots and wetlands to be storing more water in. Right, we're doing a bit of an example here at Purdue where we're doing a drainage water recycling project, and we have a structure that allows us to hold more water in a remnant wetland on the Agronomy Center for Research and Education, and we can apply that water as supplemental irrigation to crops. And so it is something we've been working with the NRCS, the Corps of Engineers, and various crop extension specialists in the state. And so I think things like that, right? It's a big pain to get all of this installed, and it's fairly expensive. And so there has to be a lot of work done figuring out how to make it less expensive and easier to manage. But I think we do need to start thinking about where in our local environment can we store more water, and right, draining wetlands is the opposite of what we need.
There are other questions, one of which is about impacts of climate change trends. I assume you would probably refer people to the climate change report, that the link is in the chat for that question. And then studies of rainfall intensity trends, the increased number of high intensity, short duration events. You alluded to that, but is there anything further you'd like to say about that, or studies you'd like to point people to?
Don't know of any very recent studies, but within the last decade, there have been a few of those. Jeff Trapp, who used to be at Purdue and is now at Illinois, had a paper out about 10 years ago where they were looking at increases in intensity. And that's clearly something that we're seeing in the observational record, is that summer convective storms are becoming more intense and a little bit less frequent. And most of the climate projections are showing kind of a similar trend, and that that these storms are going to become more intense and less frequent going into the future, which aggravates things even more.
Yeah. I am going to hold the other questions in the chat just in the interest of time. Keith, thank you so much. Yep. We're going to turn now to Dave Lampe, who is going to do us two enormous favors here. He's going to talk about groundwater surface water interaction, where Keith left off, and give us a bit of an, especially for non-experts in the audience, a bit of an introduction to why that is and why it's important. And then Dave's going to tell us about some instrumentation that USGS and partners are involved in for trying to measure that. So Dave, I'm handing it over to you. And thanks again for doing this.
No problem. Are you seeing the screen with one slide?
Yes.
Perfect. And I will warn that as soon as this symposium started, I had a pop-up saying that my OS was going to be upgraded. It's asking for a password. I am not putting a password in, so hopefully all is well. But if I do cut out, that's probably what's going on. So yeah, thank you for inviting me for this. I'm gonna, as Bill stated, I'm going to be going through a little bit of the background on groundwater surface water interactions, and then talking a little bit about a project site on the Kankakee River in northern Indiana that we're starting with the NGWAS project. So let's see if I can get this. There we go. All right, so a lot of the information I'm going to be presenting on initially here for the background is taken from a couple of USGS sources, one of which being Groundwater and Surface Water, a Single Resource. This is a circular that the USGS put out. There's a QR code here if anyone would like to look at the report on their own. But it does cover a lot of these kind of questions and topics that we've been talking about so far, and that we're going to continue talking about here. So streams interact with groundwater in 3 different ways, and everyone's probably heard of gaining streams, losing streams. So gaining streams gain water from inflow from the groundwater through the stream bed, so the groundwater is actually feeding the stream in that case. A losing stream is the opposite. So the stream is losing water to the groundwater, where there's an active infiltration through the stream bed of the stream into the groundwater system, creating that losing stream. And then depending on scale, a stream can do both, and most streams do both. If you're looking at the entire reach of a stream, there'll be portions of the stream that gain, there'll be portions of the stream that lose. And that's just based on the surrounding geology and the surrounding water use and a lot of other factors. But for most of the presentation that I'm giving here at the first, I'm going to, this is going to be really basic and not really look at a lot of the complexities that can exist in the real world, that does exist in the real world. So this all starts with the water cycle. And I just wanted to plug the new water cycle that the USGS put out. This is a copy of it. The old one was just kind of the nature's water cycle. This new one actually has industrial use, has a lot of other details that the old one did not. The QR code here, if you follow that, it's actually, I found this out yesterday, it's zoomable, so you can actually zoom in. There's interactive portions of the water cycle diagram here that are really fantastic. So I just wanted to plug that. But when we talk about groundwater and surface water interactions, it all starts here. So boiling down to kind of a more local type look at the water cycle, and I want to thank someone in my past that boiled it down for me really succinctly. So groundwater moves along flow paths of varying lengths in transmitting water from areas of recharge to areas of discharge. What does that boil down to? That boils down to water moves downhill. So in real simplistic fashion, think about it in that regard. But along that same path, there's all sorts of other complications that can kind of change that. But basically, it's gravity fed. So when we start talking about gaining streams, this is a diagram from that publication that I mentioned earlier that illustrates a gaining stream. So they receive water from the groundwater system. The water table contours point in the upstream direction where they cross the stream. So hopefully you guys can see my cursor at least, but you'll see that these contours representing the water table are pointing upstream. That's indicating with this groundwater flow line that groundwater is flowing toward the stream. It stays in perpendicular with those contours, indicating that water is flowing within that stream. And then the cartoon diagram over here, you'll see the unsaturated zone, the water feeding through the groundwater system to the stream. When we look at losing streams, it's the opposite. So we see that the water table in the groundwater system surrounding the stream is lower than the head within the stream. So you see water is leaving the stream going into the groundwater system. And then also, if you look at a potentiometric surface map, you can see that those flow paths in this example are actually flow leaving the stream going into the groundwater system. And so that V points the opposite direction. You also have kind of what we talked about earlier, things change. So in a transient condition, if you had a system where you had a lower stage in your stream and the water table was lower in the system, but then you had some sort of event, you had a large precipitation event, or you had a large discharge upstream, you can have a higher stage within the stream. And in that case, this high stage will create a condition where water is moving from that high stage or from the stream into the groundwater system. And you get these areas around the stream where there's bank storage until this whole system becomes in equilibrium and it turns into a more stable situation. So as the stream level rises, the adjacent groundwater levels will rise also. And I'm, as I said before, this is kind of a simplistic model. So talking about that transient condition again, so if we're looking at a gaining reach, flow direction, we add precipitation, we add stage, we add precip, sometimes something along those lines, we get that bank storage that I mentioned. And then eventually once that condition recedes, you start going into a losing stream again as that water in the stream begins to lower. and infiltrate into the aquifer system. So this is another diagram just kind of indicating that reach or the larger scale system that I mentioned earlier. So in this case, the two red triangles might be two stream gauges that are on a specific stream. You've got an upstream gauge, you've got a downstream gauge, you've got flow coming toward us outside of the screen. You'll have groundwater flowing into the stream. You have groundwater flowing out of the stream all along that reach. And so the way that you can really identify what your gain or loss is within that reach is to really look at the change in discharge or Q from this gauge to this gauge. Whatever the change is there is either the gain or the loss along that reach of the stream. And that can, a lot of times in models, be used as an input component to help calibrate those groundwater models based on how much water is going into or out of the stream in those cells. So location means a lot. A couple of other conditions here would be disconnected streams. So this is more an ephemeral stream. So in the diagram up here on the upper left, you'll see that there's water in a stream. So think about this as an ephemeral stream that is during the spring, let's say, and there's been some recent precipitation. There's flow in the stream. That stream might not be directly connected to the aquifer below, shown in blue here. So during that high stage or during that event, you're going to have infiltration from that stream into the groundwater system. And once that event ends, or once that condition ends, you'll turn into more of a diagram like B here, where the ephemeral stream won't necessarily have water in it any longer. There'll still be a water table on an aquifer below it, but it's not connected the entire year to that stream. So that was a little bit about basics of groundwater surface water interaction. Another USGS circular I pulled some information from was this, I think someone's not muted. So another circular here would be the stream flow depletion by wells. So this is a kind of a stressor that brings in another component near a stream that also plays a factor into groundwater and surface water interactions. And so again, here's a QR code where you can download and view this circular. So if we start with a general kind of aquifer, like we talked about before, we've got unconfined aquifer, we've got a stream nearby on the right there, and we've got the water table on the land surface, and you can see the flow directions where groundwater is infiltrating and flowing straight to the stream. This is a natural condition, and groundwater will discharge to that stream. As soon as you put in a stressor or a pumping well, let's say, close to the stream at some given distance, and start pumping that well, that will begin by just pumping water from aquifer storage that's nearby that well. And so you can see by the flow directions, you have flow that's being intercepted by that well, pumping well, and then you still have flow going to the stream in between that well and the stream. But as that cone of depression expands outward, it's going to widen that influence. You're going to be collecting more water from the aquifer to that well, but there's still, in this case, water discharging to the stream. But a term that this publication uses for that type of water being intercepted by the well would be captured groundwater discharge. That is water that would have been discharged to the stream, but is being captured by this well. And as that pumping rate becomes higher, that stream, cone of depression for that well becomes larger. And then under some conditions at very high pumping rates, you can start pumping water directly from a stream as well. And that's induced infiltration. So you're infiltrating water from that stream to be collected into that well. So that's kind of the condition when pumping starts and when it's happening. But what happens when that stops? And so this top diagram here kind of shows where we left off on the last slide. When you stop producing from that well. There's no more discharge coming from that well. You can see that this orange area here is the volume of that depression that's being refilled since pumping stopped. And a lot of time, that time period of how that refills is dependent upon the conditions of the aquifer, the conditions of the water budget surrounding it, and also the stream itself. But eventually you will get back to kind of what you started with if the stressor has been removed. So that was kind of a quick go through of different groundwater, surface water connections. Like I said, those two resources have a lot of information in them that might be able to help answer questions about groundwater and surface water interactions. I'll go ahead and proceed with talking a little bit about the data that or the instrumentation that's been installed at the Kankakee near Davis site by the USGS. This is work completed by the Next Generation Water Observing Systems project within the US Geological Survey. And I want to also include Randy Bayless and Matt Hardeback from the Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana Water Science Center. This is predominantly work that has been completed by them. I've been helping out occasionally, and I was also involved in this site in its previous life when it was work was being completed in cooperation with the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. So a little bit about the Illinois Basin NGWAS and the objectives there. So the USGS has several of these different NGWAS basins. So NGWAS is the Next Generation Water Observing System. The real onus of this is to really kind of take a step back, think about how we've been monitoring groundwater, surface water, water quality in different areas and different conditions, and see if there's a different way we could really approach these things. So each basin kind of has a topic or a problem that it's centered about. And the Illinois River Basin, the topic is harmful algal blooms in the Illinois River. So the real onus here is to look at nutrients within the basin, how those are being contributed. And then the second phase of the project is to really try to develop models that can be used to predict when blooms will be happening along the reach. So utilities and other water users along the reach can plan accordingly. So a lot of the onus is on legacy nutrients within the system, and we're also looking at what's being applied in real time as well. What I'm going to be, there's a lot of different components of this project, but what I'm going to be talking about are the groundwater surface water interaction sites, and there's two of those within the basin. Quiver Creek in Illinois, which is down lower in the basin, and then the Kankakee River site, which is up in the basin in Northwest Indiana. So this is just a picture of the Kankakee River site and the work that's been done there. When we first started this work back in 2010, with Indiana Department of Environmental Management, we had a pair of nested wells here, a shallow and a deep well, where we were looking at continuous nitrate and other water quality parameters. We also have a USGS super gauge, Kankakee at Davis, that is just kind of in the background over here. So the plan was to compare what we're seeing in the groundwater system to what we're seeing in the super gauge and try to identify if we see any kind of trends there. So when NGWAS picked this up, what we ended up looking at was trying to include more parameters or things like groundwater flow direction, looking at stream bed temperature profiles, and also doing some surface geophysics to see if we can see how infiltration works within the Kankakee River and how it's tied to legacy nutrients and nutrients from local agricultural fields. So as part of this effort, we put in a lot more wells. All these yellow things are wells here. These are parallel to the berm. So you can see this protector here is the same as this protector in the lower picture. The berm is in the background here. We've got this nice gauge house on a platform. And so all of our instrumentation is located inside there. And what we're looking at is continuous nutrients in a shallow and a deeper portion of the aquifer. We're looking at flow directions and other components where we're trying to compare what's happening in nearby fields with what's being seen in the stream. So this is just a diagram showing the different wells that are at the site. The orange box is enclosing 3 wells where we have water quality sondes. Those sondes are recording water temperature, specific conductance, pH, dissolved oxygen, and oxidation reduction potential at 3 different depths, as indicated in the diagram. And then the deepest well, this DP1 well, we also have an ammonium sensor in that, so we're looking at ammonium in that well as well. We have 2 wells where we have continuous nitrate sensors. These are the SUNA sensors that we use in a lot of our super gauges in the surface water. So we have those installed as well, looking at a shallow and a deep condition there, water table and a deeper condition. And then we have 2 wells with the groundwater flow direction and velocity sensors. These sensors are something that the USGS Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana Water Science Center has been using for many years in individual site investigations. But we identified with this NGWAS project that they could actually be deployed in a long-term fashion. So we have those deployed and they collect data regularly, daily. And I'll show a little snippet of that data here in a second. I'll show that data right now. So this is a plot that I pulled yesterday from those flow meter sensors. And so what you're seeing on this plot is a direction of flow. So we have 0 degrees down here, so north, and then north at 360 degrees. So kind of think of this as a continuous circle. And this red line indicates that most of the flow during this period in August, September, and October has been roughly north or northwest. The blue line is velocity. So this gives us groundwater flow velocity, how fast the groundwater is flowing through that well where the sensor is installed. And then this stair step plot is precipitation. So what you can see here is during individual storms, you can see how something has changed in the groundwater system. We're seeing a change in the direction or the slight change in the direction or an increase in velocity during those storms. And in particular, this larger storm here, which is roughly a 2-inch storm in early October, you can see a large upkick in the velocity associated with that, but real no change in direction at this point. So we're going to zoom in onto this storm here and show it a little bit closer. So like I said, you can see the storm pop up here. You can see velocities change. You have another little storm here where you saw a little deflection in direction and another change in velocity as well. So if we start pulling in the water quality data, if we look at nitrate from a comparable screened well with this flow meter, you can see how nitrate actually changed within those events as well. So we have the precipitation event, we have the velocity increase, and we can see that nitrate has decreased during that event. Same thing here, we have some more rain, we have another decrease in nitrate, and then following that event, you see nitrate increasing again upwards in this instance, upwards to 6 milligrams per liter. And I will say that a lot of this data has been collected and put into our database, but we have not quality assured a lot of this data yet. So we're looking at really just trends here. The actual values here, we still need to make sure that these are correct. And we take samples occasionally on a regular interval as well, and we compare that continuous nitrate data to those samples as well. And that has not happened yet on this. This is relatively provisional data. If we look at temperature, this gold line indicates temperature, so you can see a drop in temperature at the same time as this storm, and another drop in temperature as well on this at this storm, so you can see a change in groundwater temperature at those sites in those times as well. And then I haven't made any other plots as far as the other water quality sensors, but like I said, this is a kind of an ongoing process. We actually just got these flow meters running this fall. So this is a relatively first look at this data and seeing how it compares with these other parameters. So it's something that we're excited to continue looking at and making some more comparisons on as well. And just finishing up here real quick, I didn't have time to talk about everything we've done at this site, but there's so many things that are going on, and we're actually going to be trying to do some field days at the site as well when we have things going on in next year. We've done a lot of surface geophysics at the site. We're currently measuring stream bed temperature continuously, and we're going to use that in a model to identify stream bed flux through the Kankakee to kind of pair with the flow direction and the nutrient data as well. There has been aerial geophysics flown and surface geophysics to identify subsurface materials. There has been collection of isotopic samples for age dating to identify the recharge age of the waters within the groundwater system there. And we're also working on a new dashboard because all the data we have at this site is kind of overwhelming our existing ways of displaying data through USGS INWIS Web. So we're trying to develop a dashboard so people can kind of see everything that's going on at these sites and how they kind of interact with each other. And that's all I have. I'll leave it with a nice sunsetty picture of the field site, and we can go to questions.
That's lovely. Thank you, Dave. We're actually going to do a combined question and answer period after Marty. So we can pose questions to each of you because Marty's got field research as well as his own background on this topic. So Marty, if you are ready to switch us over and share your slides and get underway, and then we'll do a Q&A for both of you guys after that. There we go. We can see that just fine.
So you can see this okay?
Yeah, looks good. Thanks, Marty.
And you can hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
I saw David's email, and I was trying to think about some of the slides that he would show and trying to avoid some duplication. So there may be a little bit of duplication because the USGS circular that he showed, the one by winter, is one of the really famous, I guess, kind of grandfather papers on groundwater surface water interactions. So people tend to cite that circular frequently. But I wanted to start off with what I think is a pretty picture of Ross Reserve. The Ross Biological Reserve is managed by the biology department at Purdue. And I've been working out there with students since basically 2015. And so today I'm going to give you some overlapping information that David provided, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the ongoing research at Ross Biological Reserve. Let me see if I can get this to go forward here. There we go. So just quick acknowledgements. A lot of this research started from a small seed grant in 2015, and I've been able to build off of that seed grant. So seed grants like this are always important in terms of getting the research completed, but getting bigger research funding coming in. And I'm showing some of the collaborators here from Purdue and some of the undergrads and grad students who have helped me over the past few years. Carrie Rabinald, for example, was critical in getting me out to Ross Reserve and getting this research started. So some of the next few slides will overlap a little bit with Dave's, and I apologize for that. Again, I was trying to think about some of the things that he would show, and obviously it's hard to avoid some of the overlap, but in general, what are groundwater surface water interactions? We could think of these as simply exchanges of water between groundwater systems, aquifers in this case, and surface water systems. These could be creeks, streams, rivers, ponds, lakes, wetlands. So again, this is just an exchange of water. And as Dave said, it's usually a two-way exchange. It's analogous to a revolving door. There's water coming into a system from, say, groundwater to surface water, And in some cases, there's water that's being lost from a surface water system back to an aquifer. Almost all surface water bodies are in hydrological communication with groundwater. And by communication, I mean that they exchange water, so they exchange water frequently. When groundwater discharges to a surface water body, it transports with it certain things. And this is where I'm primarily a field hydrogeologist. I do some modeling and I do some lab work. I do a lot of chemistry and I do a lot of isotopic work, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. But it's important to think about that all water sources in a watershed are not equal. So when groundwater discharges to a surface water body, for example, a river, it transports with it water. This should be obvious, it's transporting water because it is a source of water. But it's important that we account for the correct aquifer in our modeling structures, because there are different types of groundwater. There are different aquifers in the state. So it's important which aquifers are actually communicating with a certain water body. The groundwater will transport solutes from geochemical and or microbiological processes. It can transport nutrients and isotopes. So groundwater can have a very different geochemical composition and a very different isotopic composition than surface water, but groundwater tends to mediate some of those surface water compositions too, and we'll talk about that in a few slides as well. Groundwater carries with it what we call age mass. So the residence time of water is basically defined as the time that has elapsed from when a particle of water recharges an aquifer until it either discharges at a discharge point or it's intercepted by a well or some other feature like that. So the time that it spends in the aquifer from recharge to discharge is the residence time of water. And we can model that as age mass. So the water particle accumulates age as it flows down the flow path. And one of the things that I wanted to do, I was trying again to kind of think about what Dave would show. And I pulled up some data, which I don't think I've shown to anyone so far, but some heat data. So groundwater transports heat with it too. And so this can be super critical for ecological processes. And groundwater can have a different microbiological signature. So groundwater can have a very distinct microbiological community compared to surface water. So in some cases, we can use microbes as tracers for groundwater discharge. And we've done some of this in the Western US, where we've used groundwater microbes in groundwater to look at recharge from melting alpine glaciers. So a lot of the work I do is in mountainous watersheds. There aren't a lot of mountains in Indiana, so I still do a lot of work out west in the mountain hydrogeology realm. So as Dave mentioned, this is one of the figures that Dave showed. Streams can gain water from groundwater discharge. And in this figure, if you can see my cursor here, this is the land surface where the little stems of grass are shown. This is a creek or a river or stream. And this is your aquifer down here. And these blue arrows indicate the direction of groundwater flow. So in this case, you can see that the groundwater arrows are pointing to the stream. So the stream is actually gaining groundwater from groundwater discharge. So it's basically a source of base flow. And base flow means that it's one of the slow flow components that contributes to a creek or river and stream. It helps to support perennial flow or year-round flow in a creek, stream, or river. Alternatively, as Dave mentioned, streams can lose water. And so in this case, you can see that the groundwater arrows are pointing away from the stream. So in this case, this means that groundwater is leaving the stream and entering the aquifer. So this is something that you would see fairly commonly, in the western states, where you have ephemeral streams which flow only after rain events, like during the southwestern monsoon season or during the snowmelt season. Or it could be intermittent streams which flow during wet parts of the year and then they dry up during the driest part of the year. So why are these interactions important? For me, I tend to look at these things, or I try to look at these things kind of a holistic fashion. But one of the pieces of my research that's been capturing more and more of my interest lately is in the realm of eco-hydrogeology. So I'm starting to think more about how groundwater impacts species diversity in streams and surface water features. But in general, groundwater supplies critical water to these surface bodies throughout the year. but it's vital during the dry season. So again, some of these creeks, streams, and rivers would dry up during the dry season without base flow. They would dry up because they do not have that slow flow component. And groundwater, this is an important point. If you don't take anything else away from my talk, remember this, that groundwater is a moderator of change. It helps to buffer against large fluctuations in flow in some cases. We can see that it plays an important role in maintaining this longitudinal hydrologic connectivity, and this longitudinal hydrological connectivity helps to promote ecological connectivity throughout a river system. And when, like I said, I do a lot of work out west, and this is very critical to how species move throughout the year in some of these western watersheds, especially aquatic species, which cannot, leave the water body. Groundwater buffers against large fluctuations in surface water temperature. So in some of these streams, groundwater helps to moderate, say, that daily or that diurnal cycle in temperature, so they can buffer and provide some kind of thermal refuge for some of the species. Groundwater also buffers against large fluctuations in solute chemistry and residence times. We're actually seeing in some of our research that some species prefer distinct portions of a river system because the chemistry is perfect in that location for spawning, for example. And we're also seeing that there are really interesting relationships between some community structures and residence times of water. And these are very kind of low order questions, but they have really big implications for ecosystem integrity in an uncertain future, especially with respect to climate change. And as I mentioned before, aquatic ecosystem processes are uniquely tied to groundwater. And this is a realm of, it's a fairly young field of study that's growing. It's called eco-hydrogeology. And it basically looks at how groundwater is important in structuring these communities along, say, a longitudinal reach of a river. So these are some images and some results from a colleague of mine, Marty Briggs, who's done some work with, I think, some cold water fisheries in the Northeast. And some of these trout and salmon spawning sites that they're monitoring seem to coincide with places of strong groundwater discharge. So here again, their data is pointing to that these groundwater discharge points in the stream are important in moderating temperature, but they're also important in moderating the solute concentrations of the stream. And one of the other things that was kind of surprising from some of their additional research is that these groundwater discharge spots may also help the fish to avoid harmful contaminants that are in different parts of the river system. So being able to identify where these discharge points are and, being hopeful that in the long term we can figure out how to protect some of these areas is important. It's an important aspect of why groundwater surface water interactions are important. So what drives these interactions? As Dave mentioned, groundwater is constantly flowing. Groundwater, the old saying is groundwater is old and slow, surface water is young and fast. That's not always true, but groundwater does typically move much slower than surface water. And groundwater flows from high potential to low potential. As Dave said, it flows downhill. You can think this as flowing from high elevation to low elevation. And again, this is the classic image from the winter paper, the winter circular USGS paper. And here we have our recharge area in this figure. And you can see that this basically represents the topography of the landscape. So the recharge area is at a high elevation, and the discharge area is a stream, and it's at a low elevation. So your hydraulic gradient, which is basically your change in hydraulic head over some distance, would be determined by the difference in, say, your water table position here versus your water table position there. So it's higher here, it's lower here, so groundwater is going to flow toward the stream. And in this image, they're showing different groundwater flow paths. They're showing some that are have residence time on the order of days that are flowing from a certain location to the stream, some that are years that are flowing from a certain location to a stream. But the key point here is that at any point along this stream is receiving a distribution. It's not just receiving one flow path, it's receiving a distribution of flow paths. And each one of these flow paths may have a very characteristic or unique geochemical fingerprint. It may have a unique isotopic composition. The temperature may even be different, and the microbiological community may be different. So I like to tell people when I do public outreach that if you hold up a glass of surface water that's been filtered and a glass of groundwater that's been filtered, they look the same. All water looks the same. However, we can use the geochemistry, the isotopic composition, we can use the heat, and we can even use the microbiological data to understand these groundwater surface water interactions and to identify where they're occurring along a reach in a river. So these are some of the tools that we use. And in this talk, I'm going to focus primarily on the isotopes, just a really quick isotope, a few isotope slides, and then talk about heat. So one of the questions I commonly get when I do public outreach is, how do we see these interactions? And if we were doing this in person, I would bring this groundwater simulator with me. For those of us who have taken groundwater classes, for those of us who teach groundwater classes, we all know that these are critical teaching tools. And so this is basically a groundwater simulator. It's basically sand and gravel aquifers that are situated between two sheets of clear, like plexiglass, for example. In this case, the recharge zone is located here. You can see in the background that there's an aquarium pump back here, and this aquarium pump circulates water throughout the groundwater simulator. And over here is your discharge zone. So the river represents your lowest potential in the groundwater simulator. There are a set of valves here. You can see there's a valve here that I have turned off, and there's a valve down here that connects to the confined aquifer that I have turned off, but I have the river, in this case, turned on in this simulation because I wanted to show you using a video how groundwater surface water interactions actually look. So I'm not going to show you the whole video in the next slide, but imagine that if we put some parcel of dye, like red food coloring, over into this well, it would flow through this confined aquifer and eventually start making it up to the river. And so we can see that in the video. And I'm just going to show you, just kind of skim through the video because it's a little bit over 3 minutes long, but I wanted to show you why these teaching tools are so important. So in a minute, you're going to see me introduce some red dye, some red food coloring into the confined aquifer here, and you're going to see it start moving. So the first thing you can see is that the dye is moving from right to left here. So that's confirming our groundwater moves downhill statement that Dave made earlier. Groundwater is indeed moving from high potential to low potential. And I'm just going to skim through at a couple points. And you can see how that plume, we would call this a plume if it were a contaminant. You can see how that red plume is moving through the aquifer. So it's starting to elongate. And this is basically due to a process called dispersion. At the pore scale, there's differences in velocities, there's differences in packing, and all of these things affect the velocity, the transport velocity through the medium. So if you keep skimming forward, you can see the plume starting to move up. And if we start getting over here, I'm going to let it run for just a minute. You can see the plume is starting to move toward the river. And so this gives you an idea of how groundwater moves from an aquifer to a river. If you watch, you'll slowly start seeing this river turning pink. It's actually turning a little bit pink now. So some of this dye has already made it to the river. And if we fast forward, we can see that connection. Pause it here for a minute. We can see that plume is working its way to the river. So this is one way to show people what groundwater surface water interactions look like. The red food coloring moved from this well through the aquifer, and then because I have all the valves turned off except for this one, this is our low potential point, so it's pulling water toward this valve, and that's showing groundwater surface water interactions. I think it's a really interesting way to show this, and it works good in a public event. Unfortunately, we couldn't do it here. So what I wanted to do is to introduce you really quickly to the Ross Biological Reserve. This is West Lafayette over here. The Ross Biological Reserve is about 10-15 minutes west of campus. If we zoom in, we can see that this is a county park that's maintained. So Ross Hills Park is maintained by the county, but the Ross Biological Reserve is maintained by the biology department. You can see there's lots of farmland around here. There's a golf course here. There's forested land along the river. And the thing that interests me and the motivation for this research is I was curious what maintains base flow in the Wabash River and what maintains base flow in some of these smaller tributaries. So there are a set of creeks, little small creeks that drain this landscape. If you zoom in, these are a couple of the little catchments that drain down to the Wabash, and we established some monitoring sites in this catchment. So this would be the catchment for the Ross Reserve. This would be one of the catchments for one of the streams that's draining Ross Hills Park. Basically the same geology, just different management practices on the landscape itself. They're both forested, both glacial sediment. So the work started in 2015. It's been mostly, I've mostly done this with undergrad research projects. We've published a couple papers so far, one that's on its way. The motivation for this, again, is to identify the sources of groundwater that supports base flow in these streams. But here recently, I've started thinking more about which aquifer systems, which aquifer or water-bearing units are communicating with the streams, and we'll talk about why that's important in a minute. And one of the bigger questions that's starting to emerge from this research is how well connected are these aquifers to the Wabash River? So that's been something that I've recently started working on. Here is a well log from a well that's located near the ravines, near the golf course there. And I wanted to draw your attention to the bottom part of the well log, actually to the well log at the bottom here. This shows the different geologic units that were found when they drilled the well. And you can see from this that you have some topsoil and clay. You have some fairly thick clay sequences here. So this is what we would call stratified drift. And you have a sand and gravel unit that's pretty common, about 15 feet below the land surface. And then you have just a lot of clay, and more clay. And then down at the bottom, about 190 feet or so, 189 feet, you hit another sand and gravel unit. So I've been really curious about how these two sand and gravel units communicate with the streams there. And so that's some of the research that I'm going to show you today, is trying to figure out how these different sand and gravel units, both of them appear to be water bearing, but they have very different geochemical components and very different isotopic components, but just trying to figure out how they're communicating with the river. So to do this, we've installed some mini piezometers in the stream. So this is me and two of my grad students installing some mini piezometers, basically small wells into the stream bed. And in some cases, you can get these things really, really deep. And so this shows one of the piezometers that's installed in the stream bed. And if you look really closely, you can see water right there. So this thing is artesian. It's definitely the water level in this mini piezometer is well above the level of the river. It's actually in one of these sand and gravel units that I was talking about earlier. We've also done some monitoring of some of the seeps. This is the upper sand and gravel unit. You can kind of see one of the seepage faces right there. This is one of the lower elevation seeps that occurs near the toe of the slope. You can see this thing is really iron rich. So there's a lot of iron being transported or from this seep. So we used isotopes and we used heat, and I wanted to just give you a really quick slide that isotopes are basically atoms with the same number of protons, but different number of neutrons. The only reason I'm showing that, so you know, and I can share these slides so that you can read the slide later. I'm not going to go through the whole slide, but whenever the number of neutrons changes, the mass of the atom changes, and we can measure that, we can quantify that. And that's important because we can use that to identify different sources of water and mixing relationships. So this image here is a 2-isotope plot or a dual isotope plot or a mixing subspace, if you want to call it. And it's basically showing delta 2H, which is an isotope of hydrogen, and delta O18, which is an isotope of oxygen. And these represent average values for the winter, and these are error bars that basically capture the standard deviation of winter precip. These are not weighted, so there's big error bars there. This green one represents spring, this orange one represents fall, and the red one represents summer. So you can see that summer precip, this is all precipitation, so summer tends to be isotopically heavier or less negative, and winter precipitation tends to be isotopically lighter or more negative. And so we can start plotting our samples from the Ross Reserve catchment into this space to see where the water's coming from. And so
Marty, forgive me, but I'm going to have to move you along here so we have some time for questions, okay? We've got about 15 minutes left for the session, and we want to leave as much of that as we can for questions.
Okay.
All right, appreciate it.
Yep, so I'm going to zoom in here a little bit and show you some of these, where some of these seeps are located. Here's two of the seeps. This is one of the seep that's located near the top. This is one that's located kind of in the mid reaches. Here are some of the toe of the slope seeps. These are the low elevation seeps closer to the river. You can see they're isotopically distinct from one another. Here are some of the piezometers that we installed in the stream. So they're close to the seeps at the low elevation. And here are the stream samples. And the stream samples appear to be a mixture of groundwater from the upper and lower units. And some of the downstream tributaries seem to be supported by groundwater from the lower sand and gravel. So you can see that these streams are not just one type of groundwater. They're kind of a mixture of this upper sand and gravel and lower sand and gravel unit. And the very last thing I want to show, and we can just flip through these really quickly, are some of the slides with the heat. Here again is one of the upslope seeps. This is zooming in at one of the seeps. You can kind of see the discharge point here. And so one of the things that we did is we bought a cheap FLIR or FLIR attachment for a camera. And my master's student proceeded to measure, I believe, every windowsill and door frame in West Lafayette to look for leaks when he bought this thing. But we can take this to the field and we can look for discrete groundwater discharge points. So this is looking at one of these slopes. And you can see these two seepage faces in this thermal image because the groundwater is warmer. The groundwater coming out of the ground is warmer, and you can see that's a very discrete point for groundwater discharge. We can look at these big seepage faces like this one. Here's where groundwater is coming out of the seepage face, and over here we have some tufa that's being deposited, like travertine that's being deposited. When we look at this with a thermal image, we can see that there's groundwater, some strong groundwater discharge kind of coming from this area here and flowing down over that bank. We can even look at some of these lower seeps in this case, and these seeps also show this really warm zone. And so this warm zone denotes where groundwater is discharging from the subsurface into the stream. So we can use these really novel tools like isotopes and tracers to understand where these groundwater surface water interactions are occurring and where the water is actually coming from. And that's really where I wanted to end the slide presentation.
Marty, that was terrific. Thank you so much, and love the way in which your presentation and Dave's presentation work together. We do have time for some questions. Obviously, some of the questions are about how these things translate into kind of management and policy questions. And so I'll just start with the observation that we've just heard over the course of this session, that groundwater and surface water are in communication with each other, that we exchange water between aquifers and surface water bodies, that this happens all the time and pretty much everywhere. But from a law and policy standpoint, we treat these as if they're completely separate resources. That surface water withdrawals don't just come from a surface water resource. Groundwater withdrawals, if you have a well on your property, that's it. You're only drawing water from the land under your property. Clearly not true. So that's a gap between what we understand and the way we the way we manage water resources and the way we do law and policy. With that as preface, then, I'm going to ask Dave and Marty a couple of questions. One is, we've had some questions in the chat about recharging groundwater, which is a deliberate move of, I mean, there's natural recharge that you guys have described where you have a losing stream that's you know, contributing water to a groundwater resource. But there's also deliberate recharge where human beings, you know, take surface water deliberately and move it underground. Marty, obviously, with all your work out west, you're very familiar with this as a practice. Do you know of any place in the Midwest that does this? What are the prospects for doing this? And then Dave, sort of same question to you.
Dave may know more about the Midwest. I'm more familiar with some of the practices they're doing out west, where they
Sure.
There's a variety of ways they can do it. They can capture the water in the reservoir and directly pump it in. They can have natural infiltration galleries which collect runoff, slow the runoff down, and allow it to recharge. I think over last year, I think California, for example, paid some of their farmers not to plant their fields and flooded their fields in hopes of getting
Right.
more water to infiltrate and recharge. In the Midwest, I'm not sure. Dave would maybe know that answer better than me. I can't think of any place where in Indiana that's occurring.
Yeah, I can't think of anything anywhere either. I think a lot of that happens out west, and if there's anyone on the call that might know of something in Indiana, please put it in the chat. The big difference, you know, is the more arid climate, you know, in the West. And I'm just thinking here too, if you were to try to do something like that in Indiana or the Midwest, you would have that, wouldn't be, it's kind of difficult to say it's an issue, but you would have, you know, plants that would be uptaking that water and potentially using some of it, so that it wouldn't be a huge draw, but that is something that you wouldn't necessarily have out west in some of the areas that I'm aware of anywhere where they do that.
Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to combine a couple of questions that people have posted in the chat and direct them to you as a kind of a two-part question. One is that you can clearly understand from your presentations that withdrawals of groundwater can impact surface water streams. So one question, one sort of variation on this question is it largely a one-to-one kind of impact? Like if you're pumping adjacent to a stream and you're extracting X amount of water through wells, that you're depleting the stream by that same X amount. So that's sort of part one of the question. Part two of the question is about then discharging water. If you're extracting groundwater in one location, but then that water is discharging to surface water in another location, can that have not just depletion effects on the surface water in the first location, but impacts on the surface water in the sort of the receiving location, aggravating erosion problems, for example, if you're introducing a lot of surface water into a place that more than it normally has. So how close is it to a one-to-one impact of groundwater withdrawals on surface water withdrawals, and then discharge impacts on surface water resources?
I think as far as the first part of that question, I think when I was showing those diagrams, I mentioned that those are more simplistic type diagrams. So the diagrams make it look like it's more of a one-to-one, but that's where things get complicated with the groundwater system. So there's heterogeneity, there's different types of sediment that might be involved, and so it's hard. It's a hard question to answer as far as if it's one-to-one or not. That's where things like groundwater models, groundwater flow models, more data collection can really help identify how related those two items are as far as pumping in the groundwater and the surface water.
Okay, let me get a quick reaction Sorry, Dave, to cut you off, but I'm going
Go
to
for
get a
it.
quick reaction from Marty, and then I need to toss to Jill, who wants to share a little bit more about what we do know, don't know, and would like to find out. Marty, thoughts about both of these things, the relationship between depletions and then discharge impacts on surface water?
Yeah, the first question's somewhat situationally dependent. It really depends on, like Dave mentioned, the pumping well is going to be extracting, at some point it's going to be extracting some amount of surface water, but it's also going to be pulling groundwater too. So it's not always a one-to-one relationship. It depends on a lot of the aquifer structure, how close it is to the river, those sorts of things, and the exchange rates, some of the things that we have trouble quantifying in the real world. The second question is a little bit complicated to answer too. It's really kind of situationally dependent also. In terms of where you discharge that water, it can have impacts. Some places it may not have as severe impacts as you would predict. We need models like Dave mentioned to analyze some of these things.
Sorry. We are really grateful to both of you. There have been comments in the chat about how informative and beneficial this has been. I certainly want to echo those. Keith, Dave, Marty, thank you all so much for all this information. The recording of this session will be available at the Purdue Institute for Sustainable Future website for those of you who want to go back and look at this some more. But for right now, to close us out, I want to hand back to Jill Hoffman of White River Alliance. Jill.
Hi, Bill. Thanks. And thank you guys so much as well. You seeing a thank you slide, I assume, up there, everyone?
We do.
Okay, perfect. And I know there were just a couple of questions I was panning the chat for too. So guys, presenters, if you want to look there while we're still going for just a few minutes and see if you can answer those, that would be great. And also, I guess, just make ourselves available to you if you have follow-up questions that you want us to pose to the speakers after this. This conversation doesn't have to stop here. We want to be a resource for you that way, as does Purdue. So just feel like you always have an open door to follow up on these things that you learned today. Just wanted to tell you we have a lot of good work ahead of us regarding the summit. As I mentioned, this forum sits in the context of a number of conversations, and then we get together once a year in August to check in on things and try to advance regional thinking about water management and policy. Wanted to thank the Nina Mason Pulliam Charitable Trust, who makes the summit possible and a lot of these forums possible. On the good news front, you guys saw a lot of instrumentation that these guys were talking about. I'm not sure if you're aware, our state is a bit woefully uninstrumented when it comes to answering some of these hard questions. So we have launched a new project that has arisen out of the Water Summit Working Group with support from the Indiana Finance Authority. So we just started on this last week. And the goal here is to take a look at our data network, where we have groundwater observation wells, where we have gauges, where we have the volunteer network in place, where we have super gauges that also do water quality. I was super interested to see Dave's got a lot of interesting sensors in that well up in the Kankakee on quality and transportation of water through a system. So lots can be learned if we make the right investments. So what we're going to try to do here is meet with several agencies and groups, utilities and other people about the network and strategically figure out where enhancements would help us answer questions both about supply and quality. So kind of an optimization exercise here that we're going to work on. The end game would be a set of recommendations that we could push forward to our policymakers for funding, or our programs that have funding already, do some alignment with that, alignment with our researchers like the folks you heard from today. So lots going on. The maps here show you that network. They also show you where we have done, the state has done some water studies in regard to quantity. So just drawing your attention to the red box there where the next regional water study will be taking place shortly. That is out for proposal and contract now. So IFA will be funding and coordinating that effort in that red area where we have a lot of interest in water supply issues. So We will be trying to make sure that the strategy around the wells engages help inform studies like this one and future studies. So I guess if it's my last pitch here, if you think that work is important and you now understand why we need to monitor those connections better to answer some significant questions, just encourage you to stay involved in our efforts on these forums, as well as at the summit this August on the 21st and 22nd. So I'll leave you with that. So you can mark your calendars and feel encouraged that the conversation does not stop here, and we're going to continue, and we'll need your help and support as we develop recommendations around better understanding of our water resources statewide. I think that's all I've got, Bill. So with that, we're pretty much right on time. Again, feel free to drop some questions in chat. If you want to linger, maybe our folks will be around for a few more minutes, but otherwise, look forward to seeing you all in August and at forums and conversations before then. Thank you. Lynn, thank you also, if you're still out there.
Yes, thank you all for attending today, and I hope to see you guys all very soon in our next summit.